All right, before we get started, Jim, would you mind listening to an opening prayer? Four. All right, there we go. Not sure what number 5 was happening, but number 4 is loud and clear. All right, today's lesson is chapter 3, starting on page 22 in our books. Does everyone have a book? I think there should be some more back there. There's some in the back if anybody needs one. And there's quite a few verses for our lesson today. So what I want to do is get some volunteers. I've got it kind of broken up into about maybe 4 sections. So I also want to start with verse 21. It's referenced a little bit later in the chapter. But so 2 Samuel 14, if someone could read verses 21 through 28. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay, and somebody could read 29 through the end of the chapter. Okay. And now verses 1 through 6 of chapter 15, 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 6.
Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the road to the gate, and when any man who had a lawsuit was to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out to him and say, Then every man who has a lawsuit or claim could come to me, and I would give him justice. And whenever a man approached to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom dealt this way with all Israel, who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel.
And then finally, chapter 15, verses 7 through 12. Okay.
Now it came to pass after 4 years that Absalom said to the king, please, let me go to Hebron, and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt in Geshur in Syria, saying, if the Lord indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said to him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent spies throughout the tribe of Israel, saying, as you hear the sound of the trumpet, you shall say, Absalom reigns over Hebron. And Absalom went 200 men from fighting from Jerusalem. They went along instantly and did no nothing. Then Absalom sent from Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor for the city, and while he offered sacrifices, and conspiracy grew strong, and the number of Absalom continually increased in number.
I was hoping you'd know it that way. When I get to it, I'll be able to say it too. Exactly. All right, I appreciate everybody. We're taking time to read. And like I said, it's a fairly lengthy, lengthy lesson. The lesson itself, though, is pretty short. Sometimes we have a really, really short lesson with a lot of, information about it. And then sometimes it's kind of cut and dried as far as what's in the lesson text. Like I say, a little more reading, but, a fairly short lesson still. So in our introduction on page 24, we talk about Paul's sermon at Antioch in Pisidia. The apostle recounted how God removed Saul from being king of Israel and placed David in that position. And one thing I was going to note at first is it talks about the king. But I thought it was kind of odd that it never really mentioned King David necessarily, or his son Absalom. When I first was glancing over it, and it's like, he's going to the king. They didn't ever say he went to his father, the king. And I just thought that was kind of different, just like he was referred to as the king throughout the whole lesson. But obviously he was put there in that position. And then Paul repeated God's description of David, as we see, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do my will. And when David is remembered today, it's usually for the man after God's own heart. He placed a confidence in God when others did not. And when he fell short of God's expectations, he humbly repented, and he sought to please God and relied upon him. And I think that's true of us when we think of David. Obviously we think about the sin with Bathsheba, we think of that, but we also think about how he continually tried to do everything to please God. And then the next paragraph, that David's disposition was admirable. It did not shield him from difficulties. Despite being forgiven of the sin with Bathsheba, the king dealt with consequence of his action the remainder of his life. And as the prophet Nathan predicted, the sword did not depart from David's house. So obviously he had the death of his firstborn child with that union with Bathsheba. And then, as we studied last week, that Amnon, who was killed by Absalom, another one of David's sons, was that continual tragedy that's happening through his house. And I think it's interesting that he said Absalom's treatment of Amnon did not change David's feelings for him. And as we get into our lesson, we start looking at timelines and things like that. I think it's kind of interesting to say that. But perhaps because he had been shown mercy, he was hesitant to convict Absalom and hold him accountable. And it says instead he longed to go to him. The man after God's own heart loved his son. All right, but obviously David did not allow Absalom to return, and like I said, we'll get into that a little bit more and give him that opportunity, except for through Joab. So let's look at Absalom, the facts of Absalom at the bottom of page 25. That the author states that we think it's unnecessary to focus on outward appearance, but Scripture often does. Do we focus on outward appearance? I think sometimes we do. There's some people that you look at and go, wow, he looks like a leader. He looks like he could do this. He looks like he could do that. Or she looks like she could do this. She looks like she could do that. It's like you kind of, in a way, you kind of judge people based on appearance. Some people look presidential, as some of the people say. That kind of that look about them. And Absalom obviously is one of those. Other ones that we talk about, Saul, he was chosen to be Israel's first king. He was said to be the, quote, most handsome person who lived among the children of Israel, and been described as taller than any of the people. Also, and then David likewise introduced as ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And so both of these cases, the outward appearance of Saul and David matched the expectations associated with the king. And as the last statement is that he looked the part, they looked the part. But then we look at Absalom, obviously one of David's sons, and what a thing they have to say about him. Now in all Israel there was none who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. I think that's something we say from head to toe. There's like, the perfection right there. That's who you're seeing. Who was it? Was Fabio? Was that the person that years ago that was supposedly this kind of a God-looking person or whatever? And it's like so many people just kind of looked up to him or whatever. You can imagine Absalom kind of being, feeling like he's in that role or whatever. He was probably proud of it. I'm sure that, when people praise you for things, it probably just makes your head even bigger, doesn't it?
I'm sure he looked in the mirror.
Yeah, you don't think...
At least in the water, if he didn't have a mirror.
Exactly. And I think it's kind of a vanity thing to do when you've got the look or whatever, and, you're kind of, primping yourself every day, and, you want to continue that. And we'll talk about the hair a little bit here too, but that was his most notable characteristic they talked about was his hair, which he cut yearly because it was heavy on him. And then it goes into a little bit more details about this hair. It's not just a kind of a one and done thing. And as we're going to be looking next week, what he took the great pride in served as a snare as his hair becomes entangled in a tree before his death. And one of the things I did look up too is, how heavy is that hair he was talking about? Well, one of them, and that's why I was looking at the shekels, and it said a shekel is about 11 grams. And it mentioned, 200 shekels, which would be about 2,020 grams. A gram is 454 grams in 1 pound. So I'm coming up with like 4.8 pounds of hair, nearly 5 pounds of hair every year.
The New Record Standard footnote says about 4 pounds.
Okay, so somewhere between, I'll say this. There's no way I could make that much hair grow on my head. At this point, with what I'm starting to get and everything else, I'd be happy if I get a few grams of mine, maybe a shekel or two. But it's like, anyways, that's a lot of weight. If you think about it, shaving or cutting off your hair once a year and getting somewhere between 4 and 5 pounds of hair, that's pretty heavy. You can feel you're kind of top heavy or something on that. But and it talks about he grew strong and healthy because and that's what the author talked about is like he was just so perfect. He was so healthy, and even his hair grew strong, and it's a part of all of that. All right, so now talk about whether one of the possibilities again. The authors always throw in these. It is possible that the author mentioned Absalom's hair in order to associate him with Esau or Samson. There again, I'm not sure where necessarily that was pulled from, but it does say that it was not religiously based on his cutting of the hair. So let's look at Numbers 6, verse 18. And this is a couple of examples of the hair and what, the Nazirite vow. Okay, so Numbers chapter 6, verse 18. We read, "And the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire that is under the sacrifice of the peace offering." And then also in Leviticus chapter 14, verses 8 and 9. Leviticus 14, verses 8 and 9. "And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all of his hair and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and then he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean." So with Absalom, it doesn't mention anything at all about any type of Nazirite vow or anything like that, but just that the hair is, it's heavy on my head, so therefore I'm going to cut it off once a year, and then I'll grow it right back because I'm so strong. And you kind of think about his vanity again, I would think on that. So Anyway, any thoughts or comments about the hair? All right, so following that description, we have the account that talks about his kids. They had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and the daughter was named Tamar after his sister who lived in his house. And whether he chose to name this name to honor his sister who was humiliated by Amnon, or to signal that he had not forgotten how David failed to punish Amnon for his behavior is not clear. Regardless, Absalom did not intend to remain in isolation in Jerusalem forever, and he wanted the opportunity to appear before King David, but he would only wait so long. And obviously last week we looked at that as far as what Absalom did to Amnon based on what Amnon did to his sister. So that revenge of his brother, and then we're going to look at the reason behind that. So any other thoughts as we move on to our next section? All right. So and the reason I wanted to read before, he had left, been exiled for in a different land, and then with Joab, he put the words in a lady's mouth to go to king and request that he actually be able to move back to Jerusalem. And during that time, he'd been gone for several years, but even after he moved back home, for 2 years he lived there and never got to see David. He was basically kind of a prisoner in his own camp, wasn't he? That he's like this consequences of what he did and the actions, even though he was basically back home, he was still not able to see David, his dad, and was not being able to summon. So that's when he went to Joab. Well, why did he go to Joab? Well, Joab's the one that originally got him to come back to home to start with, right? So he kind of became this mediator. So he thought, well, if he brought me back the first time, he would be the one to allow me to come back and actually see my dad, King David.
And Joab always had access to the king. He was, David wasn't going to turn Joab away if he came to his presence.
Right, and
he was too powerful.
and we'll see when Joab finally did go, he relented, didn't he?
Ignored Joab.
Exactly. All right, so because he was instrumental in that return, he was likely seen as his mediator. So then you got Absalom, he asked Joab, hey, let me set up a meeting with us. Let me see the king. And Joab kind of ignored him, didn't he? So he asked a second time. What happened? He ignored him again, didn't he? So then he thinks, well, if he's going to keep ignoring me, I'm going to get his attention. And that's how he did it. So he instructed his servants to set Joab's barley field and set it on fire. Did that get Joab's attention? Yes, it did. I think it's kind of interesting, though, because it says, Joab arose and came to Absalom's house and said to him, why have your servant set my field on fire? He's kind of oblivious to this whole thing about, he's been asked several times to do something. He didn't do anything. So then he knows real quick who it was, didn't he? He knew it was Absalom's servants. And Absalom replied, look, I sent to you saying, come here so that you may send me to the king to say, why have I come from Jeshurun, where he had been living in exile? It would have been better for me to still be there. Now, therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there's iniquity in me, let him execute me. So I think it's just one of those things where, sometimes you ask and you don't get an answer. So you're going to go overboard, really. It's like, I'm going to get his attention. And this is absolutely what I think Absalom did.
Something about Absalom, too, his character, right?
Yeah.
He didn't mind doing whatever it took. It didn't mean burning up somebody's field or doing,
Well, and even taking the action in his own hands with what happened to his sister. He was, if David's not going to do anything, I'll take care of him. And I think that was just, definitely really quick to action and not willing to, or not afraid to get his hands dirty. Although, did he do the actual killing? Did he do the actual setting of the field? No, he had his servants do all his dirty work for him, didn't he? He's kind of, he commanded them and had them do the work. But obviously it was coming from him, the commands for that. All right, so once he set the fields on fire and they had their transaction, then obviously Joab went to King David and he called for a meeting with his son. And then when he came before the king, Absalom bowed himself on the face to the ground before the king, and in turn David kissed Absalom. And I wasn't really sure about the whole, what we've got in here, but it said the forgiveness granted was not, kind of forgive and forget. I forgive you, I'm going to take you back in as my son, everything's fine. It was more of okay, we're not guilty. You know, you're not going to be punishable by death, but it doesn't mean we have a good relationship, does it? That, you know, he was freed from the sort of house arrest. You know, the fact that he'd been back home for, you know, for 2 years and no charges were brought against him for killing Amnon, but the relationship had not really improved, had it? And there was still, you know, there's still some tension that remained between them, quite obviously. And
If Absalom, I mean, on David's part, it would seem to me that if Absalom had, done what he should have done, really, after he came back after, because we're about to get into the rest of the story here about, wanting to be king, if he had not done all of that, I think, David probably would have become quite happy with him and let bygones be bygones.
right. But like you said, you can see kind of that character of Absalom, how, I'm going to say motivated he was. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to be fine now. All right, I got forgiveness for my sin, for killing my brother, for what he did to my sister, and all things are fine now. I'm going to take my role, and that's what, like Jim mentioned, we're going to get into that, and kind of be content with my role in life. I'm going to, support the king, my dad. I'm going to do all these things, but he had bigger, better goals than that, didn't he? He had, he wanted to take what he had, and he wanted to go even further. And that's what we're going to read in 2 Samuel 15 and the first 12 verses. And the author says, rather than taking his place in the royal court and supporting his father, he began his attempt to steal the throne from King David. And that's when he started supplying himself with the horses and the chariots and having people run before him. It's almost like a big political campaign, isn't it? You've got to imagine these horses and chariots and running before him. They were kind of spreading the word, weren't they? You're kind of, planting the seeds about, things about how wonderful Absalom was, and trying to get some people on his side in this political posturing. And he attempted to make himself look like the king in the eyes of the people, but obviously this was only part of his ruse. Turn to the top of page 28. He aspired to gain the allegiance of the people. By greeting, acknowledging, and pandering to the people of the land, he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it states that it did not necessarily mean that he felt like people were warm to him, that the heart is often the intellect as well as emotions. Thus, the win was to win rather than win the affection of the Israelites, he stole their minds. He deceived or duped them in order to overthrow David. And I think that happens a lot of times. People come on the scene and they start teaching things, and they kind of, you drink the Kool-Aid. We've talked about that before. You get people just kind of so wrapped up, they're not really paying attention to the message and what you're saying, but their emotions and things like that kind of get wrapped up in it, and maybe they think there's some gain for them in that situation. Maybe he thought, hey, if Absalom rises up and we're friends with him now, maybe we'll get to rise up with him or something. But it also reminds me of basically the commercials that you see on TV all the time with lawyers. They take any situation whatsoever. Oh, you slipped and fall? Come to me. I'll get you all your money's worth or whatever. And I think Absalom was probably doing the same type of thing. When you look at where he sat at the gates and people came and they're wanting to see the king to get some type of decision made, his pen or his part right there was like, sorry, but you've got a great case. And if there was somebody there to hear it, I'm sure you would do good. You would win your case, but unfortunately, there's not. If I was there, though, I would be glad to take care of you. I mean, I would give you the justice you deserve. Call me Alabama or whatever. Sorry for the Shannara fans. But you can see what I'm saying, that there's this kind of this tendency to kind of, you're in a bad situation, but I could put you in a better situation. And we had an employee like that at one time. He felt that he was fired unjustly, and he went to one of these lawyers, not one of the big names that you hear or whatever. But when we went through the deposition for it, and that phase, we all met together with the lawyers on both sides and a mediator, and we laid out the times he was late, the times he didn't show up to work, the times that he had issues with his work, his performance, things like that. And at one point, the lawyer for his side asked our lawyer if they could have a little conference outside in the hallway. A few minutes passed, they come back in, we continue the deposition, and go on with it. We didn't have a verdict at the time. But after it was over, we talked to the lawyer and said, what was that about? And he said, well, she just basically said look, my client doesn't have anything to stand on. Can you give us something? I mean, even like $500, whatever, just so we can end this. And our lawyer said, no, the facts are on our side. And, of course, she took the case thinking, oh, here's a good situation where somebody got fired unjustly, and I'm going to get some money off of it. Once she heard the facts from both sides, she was really just to say, hey, can I have anything for my time? Because she got kind of pulled into this situation, and basically he didn't have a leg to stand on. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but, I thought back the same thing about, I felt like this is the way Absalom was. He was calling to get everybody he can, whether they have a case or not, come on to my side. Come on to my side, and, we're going to do good in the end. We're going to take over. We're going to have this rebellion, and, we'll all live happily ever after. So how long did he do this? And this is, I'm not sure why there's a difference in between the New King James Version or the other versions like ESV, because this is 40 years, and then the other versions say 4 years. And they said the efforts most likely lasted only 4 years, because later on it was still mentioned the young man Absalom. If it had been 40 years, I don't think you could say 40 years plus his time before that would necessarily be a young man by any standards. But following that period, he asked the king for permission to go to Hebron and pay the vow which he made to the Lord. And I think at this point, David's got to be, wait, all the things that you've done, you've never shown any, religious type dedication whatsoever. And now you're wanting to go, you took a vow that you're going to, if you were able to go back to Jerusalem, then you're going to serve the Lord. Given his godless ways, it seems unlikely that such a vow was taken. But what did David do? He's saying, no, I don't believe that you took a vow like that. No, he said, okay, if you took the vow, go do it. Did he know what was going to happen because of that? Do you know why Absalom was leaving? No, I don't think so. But he wasn't going to stand in the way. It's almost like he's taking him at his word. He's taking it at face value that, all right, if you made that vow, I'm not going to stand in your way of you breaking that vow, that promise. Even though there was obviously ulterior motives between that, but, like I said, at this point, David, he's not going to interfere with it. You made the vow, you take care of it. And
It's hard to imagine as open as Absalom was at the city gate and so on with all of this, that word had come back to the king through some of his aides and so on about what Absalom was up to.
right.
I mean, it's almost, it seems like to me it'd be almost impossible for some of the king's eyes / spies, so to speak, around it about not to have reported back. But, David, we've all probably, most of us that have children, that somebody has been guilty of having a blind eye, so to speak, occasionally to our kids. And, I think David was just always way too lax to his children. He just always wanted to believe the best. And here's an example of it that obviously could have cost him his own life.
Right.
In time.
Well, and that too, let's just say it's 4 years that he's been by the gate. So all this time, I'm sure people have been coming to the king for judgments, right? Then all of a sudden, the judgments just stopped. Nobody's coming anymore. I guess nobody needs to be judged. Nobody needs justice or whatever. Well, exactly like Jim said, they had to have known that something was going on because he was turning people away. He was basically saying, if there was somebody there that could hear your case, you have a great case. But he's turning them away, so nobody's even going to the king at all, is what it sounds like, is it? So between that and obviously the people that are hearing things and telling David, hey, look, this is what's going on. He's standing by the gate and he's telling people that they don't have a mediator, they don't have somebody that would give them justice and things such as that. And definitely something was brewing, something was being cooked up. So nevertheless, David, who understood the importance of keeping the vows one makes to God, gave Absalom his blessing to go. And this is where Absalom turns to the treachery, that he used the opportunity to send spies throughout the tribes of Israel, and they stirred up the people and urged them to proclaim that Absalom reigns in Hebron. And then adding to that treachery, Absalom calls for Ahithophel, is that right, Doc? David's counselor to join in the conspiracy, and that this challenge to the throne would not be easily dismissed, for the people of Absalom continually increased in number. And at this point, it says David can no longer ignore Absalom. So he's kind of, let the thing happen. He's let everything go through his courses. And all this time, it's like Absalom's kind of silently kind of building his numbers. He's building his team. He's building, the ones that are going to, kind of help support him or kind of lift him up to that throne that he's wanting. So that's where they start sending people out. And the more, it's kind of like anything else. If you hear something over and over and over again, eventually you may believe it, right? When they're talking about how great Absalom is, you hear somebody's great all the time. Well, he sounds like a pretty good guy. I think I'll put my support to him too. Because he's out there preaching. He's handsome, exactly. He's got the look, doesn't he? So, his fame had to be spreading throughout the area. But if you knew the whole story, if you knew what he was doing and what had happened and things such as that, you might have a little different opinion of him, right? And, when we get into the applications, we'll look at it a little bit and then we'll ask some questions. I know we're getting close on time. But, and again, next week we're going to be looking at more of what happened, kind of the rest of the story, so to speak, of continuing to build the troops and then eventually his death. But like I say, I don't want to jump ahead too much on that. All right, any other thoughts or comments? Okay, so let's look on 29, the application. And I think these are some good points that sin must not be ignored, nor should it be accepted as inevitable. And the problems with David and Absalom began when the king failed to properly respond to Amnon's actions and refused to punish his firstborn. This does not excuse the behavior of Absalom. His retaliation was also sinful. Nevertheless, had David dealt with Amnon properly, the situation with Absalom might have been different. So what are your thoughts on that? Once Amnon did what he did to Absalom's sister, what if David would have enacted some strict punishment on Amnon?
It said he was, said of him, of David, that he was very angry. But that's all it said about it. I mean, as far as the record is concerned, David took no action against Amnon.
Right. And if you're in Absalom's shoes, this is my own sister, his half-sister, Amnon's half-sister. Do you think it kind of made him set up for, brewing and getting angrier and angrier? It's like, had something been done, had justice been served, had at least something happened, then maybe I wouldn't have to do what I did. Sometimes swift judgment, I think, is better than, putting it off, because when you put things off over and over and over again for long periods of time, the other side of it that feels like they've been, disowned or kicked to the curb or whatever, they're going to be brewing. They're going to be thinking, this is not right. Maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe next year.
We all know that in life, that problems defer, right? I mean, if you got problems in your life or problems in the workplace or whatever, they're not going to go away by themselves, right?
Exactly.
So, just to, look the other way. This poor
Yeah.
approach to engagement or fatherhood or whatever, right?
Yeah, and we've been through that before so many times with employees, going back to somebody that's been late or doing things like that. And we've kind of said, if an employee starts off being late, 2 or 3 times in the first few weeks they're working, they're not going to get better. And when I was younger, I always want to say, oh yeah, they will. They've had the train stopped on this day and they had car trouble this day. But then they stay on and they keep having that same habit, don't they? It's kind of like if you're going to be prompted on time in the first few weeks, you're probably going to be prompted on time for the rest. If you're going to be late and don't really care and show up when you want to start with, you're probably going to stay that way. Most of the time, people don't change.
Their grandmother died several times.
Yeah, exactly. You wonder how many grandmothers they have. Exactly. But you see what we're saying? It's like, sometimes the swift action can cause a lot of I'm going to say, future problems to be remedied already. If you take care of that person first and say, look, if you can't get here on time, we're going to have to write you up. If you can't get here after that, we're going to have to let you go. You're going to have to find another job. Or you work with them, you try to work with them, and then years later, you're still doing the same thing every day, every week. You don't know if this guy's going to show up or not. And the problem just keeps getting worse and worse and worse because he thinks, well, I've gotten by with it this time. Why should I start coming to work early now? And obviously this is a bigger situation here, but for how long can you sit there and wait and say, look, you did something that was wrong. It was against the law, yet nobody's going to do anything about it. Didn't even slap him on the wrist necessarily. So, it could have changed things. Don't know for sure. I think with Absalom and his kind of his goals in life, things such as that, it probably wouldn't matter. It probably one of the things he probably would have used it anyways to say, hey, this happened and your judgment wasn't strict enough, therefore I'm going to take it in my own hands anyways. We never know. All right, so the second application, although David eventually allowed Absalom to return to his court, the forgiveness he extended to his son hardly resembles the complete forgiveness God expects his followers to grant others, and that we would do well to remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And then to be forgiven, we must be willing to forgive others. But in this situation of forgiveness that David showed to Absalom, do you think sometimes we do the same thing? You know, somebody comes to us, they ask for forgiveness, and you say, yeah, sure, I'll forgive you. But not really mean it. You know, things come back up again later, and you say, well, remember that time when you did so-and-so? It's like, wait, I thought I asked for forgiveness, and you said you forgave me. Yeah, but, you know, you did this and this and this. It's like you're bringing it back up again. Did you really forgive and forget? No. And I think in this case, too, you know, David is kind of like, you know, he's forgiven him, so to speak. He's given his kiss, his blessing, but it wasn't a full forgiveness. He's still going to kind of keep it in the back of his mind all the time. And, you know, it's hard to do sometimes, especially when somebody wrongs you over and over and over again, and they keep coming back to you for forgiveness. It's hard, you know, because you're thinking, well, you're not really asking for forgiveness, so why should I grant you that forgiveness? Because you don't mean it anyways. So you got two people saying, well, I don't really mean it, so what good is that? And like I said, I think it's something we all have to work on to truly forgive and forget. All right, then part 3. Absalom's efforts to steal the kingdom from David remind us of what wicked individuals will do to get their way. And as Jim alluded earlier, the tactics he used remain common political ploys. Even so, selfishness must be avoided. Making this point, Paul urged, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. And there again, sometimes it's hard to do, isn't it? You know, in this society, you know, what do we have? iPhone, iPad, iPod, everything seems to be like that, doesn't it? And you're always looking at yourself, you know, what can I gain? What can I do to get ahead? What can I do to do this? But you don't really think about, you know, how do you support other people? How do you encourage them? How do you, you know, like I say, avoid these type of ploys and the wicked individuals and things such as that? So it's kind of a balance in between, I think, you know, doing what is right, obviously, is first and foremost, but, you know, encouraging others and not being your selfish ambition on yourself, the conceit, and being lowliness in mind. You know, there again, it's something that's, you know, it's hard to work on. But as a Christian, that's obviously what's called on. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's run through the questions right quick. These are all pretty quick and straightforward just to see who's been paying attention. Why was Absalom praised? For his good looks. And then why did he cut his hair? Too much. It's too heavy. It's a burden on me, so I've got to cut it. So, all right. And then what did he name his daughter? Tamar. And you know, obviously we looked at that, whether it's because of that was his sister's name, and you know, her basically exile, you know, because of the situation that she was in. You know, could have been an honor to her, or the fact that she's living in the house. And then what did Absalom order his servants do to Joab's field? Burn it, set it on fire. I want to get his attention. All right, now what did David do when Absalom entered his court? He kissed him. Yep. And where did Absalom go and stand early in the morning? By the city gates. Yep. And like I say, he's already kind of working his politics right there, isn't he? He's already kind of starting to set people on his side already for all that time. And then what did he say? What did he say he would give the people? Justice. Yep, I can do this. Nobody else is going to take your side, but I can do it. You know. All right, so what did he say he wanted to do in Hebron? Yeah, pay his vows to the Lord. And then what did Absalom's spies encourage the people to proclaim? That Absalom rules in Hebron. Yep. And then finally, who joined Absalom's conspiracy?
Ahithophel. What a friend.
Ahithophel. Okay, I wasn't sure exactly how to say that. I'm glad you helped me on that. What a friend. Yep. And you know, as a closing thoughts on that, I've got to wonder, since he was David's counselor and all, what do you think changed his mind? What do you think made him decide, I'm going to go with Absalom rather than stay with David?
He saw which way the winds blowing, or at least he thought he did, so he's going to jump on the train of the guy that's going to be king.
Yep. I think so, because he's seeing all this emotion, all this like action, and everybody going, starting to put all their, playing their cards and putting it down toward Absalom. And I agree. He was probably thinking, well, he's probably going to be king. If I can support him now, then maybe I can get a better position, a better thing, once that transpires, once that changes. Exactly.
Interestingly, one of the, and I guess this, we've got to talk about him again, but Ahithophel, there's some reason to believe he may have been Bathsheba's grandfather. There are 2 or 3 passages you put them together, so that's kind of an interesting connection there.
Well, if it was, could it be kind of, exactly kind of like just a little bit of back in the back of his mind all along too about what happened and how I guess he looks at David. He just, he was promoted up through even though he did those things, and maybe there was a little bad blood there. All right, I appreciate everybody's thoughts. Any other comments before we end? All right, and like I say, next week we'll look at Absalom's death and like I say the kind of the rest of the story with him. All right, appreciate everybody's time.